The secret weapon inside the Sherman, America's invisible advantage. It was the summer of 1944. Across the shattered fields of Europe, the thunder of tank engines echoed through smoke and ruin. German Panzers, fierce, heavily armored, and feared, had ruled the battlefields for years. But something was changing. The Allies were pushing forward, faster than anyone expected. American Sherman tanks, though lighter and often outgunned, seemed to move and fight with uncanny coordination. They struck swiftly, retreated with precision, and called for artillery or air support almost instantly. To German soldiers, it looked like chaos organized by genius. But behind that brilliance was a secret no one on the German side understood. That secret was communication. Inside every Sherman tank lay an unseen technological marvel, the SCR-508 FM radio. It wasn't a weapon of steel or fire, but of information and clarity. While German tanks relied on AM amplitude modulation, radios that hissed and cracked under battle noise, American crews spoke through FM frequency modulation channels, crisp, clear, and immune to interference. This invisible edge gave U.S. tank commanders the power to think, move, and strike as one. A single Sherman could instantly coordinate with others miles away, relay real-time intelligence to infantry, or request close air support in seconds. In a war defined by seconds, that advantage meant survival. German officers were baffled. How did American armor regroup so fast after every ambush? How did their counterattacks seem perfectly timed? They assumed the Allies had more tanks or better generals, but the truth was simpler and far more revolutionary. The Sherman's radio network had turned every tank platoon into a living organism, connected, responsive, and intelligent. It was the world's first large-scale example of digital age coordination in a mechanical war. In the vast fields of Normandy and the deserts of North Africa, this technological leap quietly reshaped the art of armored warfare. For the first time, machines could talk to each other, and that changed everything. What the Germans never knew was that America's greatest weapon wasn't built from armor or firepower. It was built from sound waves. The voice of power. How the SCR-508 changed warfare. The SCR-508 radio, developed by the U.S. Signal Corps in 1942, was more than a communication tool. It was a technological leap. It used frequency modulation FM, a system that filtered out static and background noise, something the amplitude modulation AM sets used by German tanks could never achieve. Each Sherman tank carried a 50-watt transmitter and a receiver connected to a powerful whip antenna. This allowed Sherman crews to maintain constant, crystal-clear contact across a range of up to 8 miles, a massive improvement over anything seen before on the battlefield. For commanders, it was like having a battlefield nervous system. They could now see the fight unfold in real time through the voices of their men. Orders were transmitted instantly, updates flowed without delay, and coordination became natural. A tank platoon that once operated as individual machines now functioned as a single, unified force. In comparison, German panzer divisions still relied on limited radio distribution. Only commanders had full transmit-receive units. Most other tanks carried receivers only. That meant lower-ranked crews couldn't speak back, they could only listen. So when chaos struck, when smoke filled the sky and shells tore through formations, German units often fell silent. But the Americans? They talked. They adjusted. They fought back together. The SCR-508 gave them eyes where there were none, and speed where there was confusion. It made the Sherman tank far more dangerous than its gun or armor ever could. Historians today call it the invisible armor, the power that let American forces out-hink and outmaneuver the enemy, turning the tide in battles from North Africa to Normandy. Every word spoken over that radio carried the same weight as a bullet, and every clear signal meant lives saved or victories won. The Germans never knew it then, but the most advanced weapon on the Western Front wasn't a gun at all. It was a voice. The Battlefield Symphony Coordination in Normandy, June 1944. The beaches of Normandy roared with fire and thunder. Shells screamed overhead, engines howled through the smoke. and the world shook beneath a storm of steel. Yet, in the midst of chaos, something remarkable unfolded. The American Sherman tanks moved not as individuals, but as a single, synchronized force. To the Germans, it seemed impossible. How could dozens of tanks advance across flooded fields, broken hedgerows, and burning towns without losing formation? How could they pivot and strike with perfect timing, as if one commander controlled them all? The answer lay within the hum of the SCR-508 radio, the heart of the Sherman's intelligence. Each crewman had a headset pressed tight against his ears. Amid explosions and the grind of metal, a calm, steady voice guided them. Orders from the platoon leader reached every tank instantly. Reports from scouts came in seconds, and when artillery or air support was needed, it arrived with deadly precision. German forces, still relying on slower and noisier AM transmissions, couldn't match this rhythm. When a German tank commander tried to call for help, his message often drowned in static, lost in the crackling interference of machine guns and engines. But American crews spoke clearly, fast, confident, organized. The result was a battlefield symphony. Each Sherman played its role, the lead tank spotting the enemy, the flanking units cutting off retreat, and the rear tanks calling in bombardments. It was coordination, born not of instinct, but of communication. In the hedgerows of Normandy, where every field was a trap and every lane a grave, this ability to speak and react in real time gave the Americans a decisive edge. They could maneuver under fire, flank ambushes, and adapt to sudden counterattacks. Where German panzer formations hesitated, the Shermans advanced. Radio discipline became as vital as gunnery. Commanders trained their men to speak clearly, briefly, and effectively. Every word mattered. Every second counted. A single radio call could turn defeat into victory or chaos into control. And so, through the invisible threads of the airwaves, the U.S. Army built what the Germans could never see: a network of unity, pulsing with intelligence, a living force that could think, move, and strike as one. By the end of the Normandy campaign, German officers began asking a single, haunting question: how do the Americans always know what we're about to do? They never knew that the answer wasn't in numbers or luck. It was in sound, in the clear, precise voices of men linked by the most advanced radios the world had ever seen. The invisible shield. How communication saved lives on the front lines. War is chaos, unpredictable, merciless, and fast. On the battlefields of Europe, survival often depended on seconds, and silence could kill. But for the crews inside the American M4 Sherman, silence was rare. Their lifeline was always alive: the quiet hum of the SCR-508 radio. Every tank, every platoon, every commander was connected through that invisible thread. It was more than a communication tool. It was an unseen shield, a network that saved lives long before the bullets ever hit. The power of a voice. Inside the roar of engines and the echo of cannon fire, a commander's voice could mean everything. Enemy armor left ridge 600 yards. Within seconds, the message rippled through the airwaves. Turrets turned, sights locked, shells fired. An ambush that might have destroyed an entire column was neutralized before the enemy could reload. For the first time in armored warfare, information moved faster than destruction. If a tank was hit, its crew could still transmit coordinates before abandoning the vehicle, warning others of minefields, hidden guns, or enemy traps ahead. No one fought alone anymore. The human side of technology. For the men inside those cramped steel hulls, the radio was also a voice of reassurance. In a world of smoke and fire, hearing another soldier's calm tone, "Copy that, we're with you," meant more than any order could. The Sherman's radio transformed combat from isolation into cooperation. Crews learned to trust not just their own eyes, but the voices echoing through their headsets. The voices of comrades they had never even seen, yet depended on with their lives. This was the birth of team warfare, where unity, not individual heroics, determined survival. The edge of coordination. German tank crews, though highly skilled, often fought alone once combat began. Without two-way radio communication, orders became lost. and confusion spread faster than strategy. The Americans, meanwhile, adapted and countered in seconds. One tank could spot a threat, a second could flank it, and a third could call in artillery, all before the enemy even realized their position had been compromised. It was coordination on a scale the world had never seen, a coordination made possible not by more tanks, but by smarter tanks. The legacy of the invisible shield. Historians later called it the silent revolution of the battlefield. The SCR-508 didn't just help the Allies win, it changed the very definition of combat. For centuries, wars were decided by muscle, numbers, and weapons. But now, victory was decided by information and communication. Every word that traveled through that radio, every comm report, every warning, every confirmation, was another life saved, another mission completed, another step toward victory. Echoes of the airwaves, the hidden heroes inside the Sherman. They were not the gunners. They were not the drivers or the commanders who gave the orders. They were the voices in the dark, the calm under fire, the link between chaos and command. They were the radio operators of the Sherman tank. In a world of explosions, dust, and death, their weapon was not a gun, but a headset, a microphone, and a few inches of copper wire. Their battlefield was made of sound. The calm within the storm. Inside the cramped hull of a Sherman tank, every inch mattered. 5 men worked shoulder to shoulder, breathing the same recycled air, listening to the same thunder outside. And yet, in the middle of that storm, one man's voice had to remain perfectly steady. He was the operator. His hands moved quickly, tuning frequencies, adjusting the gain, maintaining a fragile line of communication through mud, smoke, and static. If the signal broke, entire units could vanish into confusion. If he failed, men could die. No matter how close the shells landed, no matter how hard the tank shook, his voice could never tremble. Red 2, advancing through the hedge. Blue leader, hold position. Artillery incoming. Brace. Each transmission was a lifeline. Each word was a thread holding the platoon together. The sound of brotherhood. For the radio men, every message carried more than information. It carried trust. They learned the voices of every tank in their company, who spoke quickly under pressure, who cracked a joke to ease the fear, who fell silent when something went wrong. Over time, those invisible voices became brothers, linked by a bond stronger than armor. They might never see each other's faces, but they knew each other's tone, each pause, each breath over the radio waves. And when one voice disappeared into static, the silence was louder than any explosion. The courage behind the headset. Operating a radio under fire was no small task. Enemy artillery often targeted antennas, and many Sherman operators were hit while trying to repair communication lines under heavy fire. But they did it anyway, because without them, the entire armored column was blind. They were trained, not just in communication, but in composure, to speak clearly when fear took everyone else's breath away, to carry the commander's will across the battlefield, when the noise of war threatened to drown everything out. Their legacy in silence. When the war ended, many of these men returned home quietly. The last transmission when the airwaves fell silent. The war was over. The guns fell silent. The thunder of engines and the crackle of radios faded into history. But the voices, the brave, steady voices that once guided steel giants through hell, still echoed in the memories of those who lived. For years, the Sherman tank had been more than a weapon. It had been a network of courage, a living chain of men, bound not by proximity, but by communication. Through the hum of the SCR-508 radio, these men had learned to fight as one mind, to think faster than the enemy, and to turn chaos into control. They had built something the world had never seen before, a battlefield connected by sound, speed, and unity, from steel to signal. In the early days of the war, tanks fought as individuals. Each crew was alone inside its armor, blind to what others saw, deaf to what others heard. But by 1944, the Shermans had changed that forever. The FM radio transformed those isolated machines into a single, thinking organism. A formation of dozens of tanks could now maneuver like the limbs of one body, guided by a heartbeat pulsing through the airwaves. It was the birth of networked warfare, the forerunner of every modern battlefield system that exists today, the legacy that spoke beyond war. After 1945, the world rebuilt itself. Cities rose from ruins, nations rearmed, and technology marched forward. But hidden beneath every innovation, from satellite communications to global data networks, was a spark first lit inside those Sherman tanks. The SCR-508 had proven a timeless truth, that the power to communicate clearly is the power to survive, lead, and win. That single lesson reshaped not only warfare, but the entire fabric of modern civilization. Echoes that never die. For the men who once sat behind those radios, the memory never faded. They remembered the cold steel under their hands, the tremor of the engine beneath their boots, and the calm voice that always cut through the noise. Copy that. We hear you. You're not alone. Those words whispered across the airwaves of history carried more than coordinates or commands. They carried hope. They carried connection. They carried the proof that even in mankind's darkest hour, communication could unite us, guide us, and ultimately, save us. Epilogue: the voice that changed the war. Today, the Sherman tank rests in museums and memorials, silent, majestic, timeless. But if you listen closely, you can almost hear it still, a faint murmur of static, a fragment of a transmission from another world, a world where courage spoke through crackling radios, where brotherhood traveled on invisible waves, and where victory began not with a bullet, but with a voice. The last transmission was sent long ago, but its message remains eternal, over and out, but never forgotten. The technological revolution, how American radios redefined modern warfare. The Second World War did not end with silence. When the guns finally stopped in 1945, a new kind of weapon still echoed through history: communication. And at the heart of that revolution stood a small, rugged box of wires and circuits. The SCR-508 radio, born inside the Sherman tank. It had proven its worth in Europe and North Africa not by firing a single shot, but by giving soldiers the power to coordinate, adapt, and survive. Yet its legacy stretched far beyond the battlefields of World War II. It became the blueprint for everything that came after. From battlefield to blueprint, the U.S. Army's engineers studied the lessons learned from the Sherman's radio network. They realized that the key to victory was not superior firepower, but superior information flow. That principal, communication as command, reshaped military doctrine for decades. Every armored vehicle that came after, from the M26 Pershing to the Cold War M60 Patton, carried a descendant of the SCR-508. Modern command radios, field networks, and even satellite links owe their design to the lessons of those FM waves in 1944. It was no longer enough for a tank to be strong. It had to speak. It had to listen. It had to be part of a living network. The birth of networked warfare. The idea spread like wildfire. By the 1950s, the U.S. military had begun experimenting with integrated communication systems, connecting tanks, aircraft, and infantry through shared frequencies. What had begun in the fields of Normandy evolved into the foundation of modern digital warfare. When you trace the history of military communication, from the radios of Korea to Vietnam's field networks, to the encrypted digital systems used today, you trace it back to a single innovation inside the Sherman: the decision to make every soldier heard. That decision changed everything. The global ripple effect. After the war, America's allies adopted similar FM technology. Britain's Centurion tanks, the Soviet Union's post-war T-series, and even early NATO communication systems were built upon the American radio concept: clarity over chaos, command through communication. It reshaped not only military thinking, but also civilian technology. The same FM modulation that guided Shermans through battle would later power broadcast radio, emergency systems, and early telecommunications. The invisible force that once moved armies would go on to connect the modern world. The legacy lives on. Today, every soldier with a headset, every commander watching a live tactical feed, and every aircraft linked to ground control owes a silent debt to that wartime innovation. The SCR-508 did more than carry voices. It carried a new philosophy. That knowledge is power. That information is survival. And that victory begins with communication.